Part 6. For much of human history, to be diagnosed with a mental illness was not to receive a diagnosis at all. It was to be handed a sentence. A life sentence served not in a conventional prison of stone and steel, but in a far more complex, far more insidious confinement. This was a prison of the mind, yes, but one reinforced by the very real walls of society's fear, misunderstanding, and revulsion. It was a sentence passed down not by a court of law, but by a court of public opinion, by neighbours, by family, and eventually by the cold, detached authority of the state. The crime? To be different, to have a mind that deviated from the accepted norm, that experienced the world through a lens of melancholy, mania, or delusion. The punishment was not rehabilitation, but removal. This brings us to a core, uncomfortable truth that underpins our entire journey into the past. A truth that is difficult to confront, yet essential to understand if we are to appreciate the fragile progress we have made. For centuries, the prevailing response to mental illness was not one of compassion or curiosity. It was not a question of healing. The core truth is this: people weren't treated, they were managed, controlled, contained, and in the process they were locked away, punished, or erased. Let's first consider what it meant to be locked away. This was a physical act, a brutal and definitive severing of an individual from the world they knew. From the 17th century onwards, the Great Confinement began. Asylums, madhouses, and workhouses rose across the landscape, monuments to a society that preferred to hide its problems rather than solve them. These were not hospitals in any modern sense. They were human warehouses, places where the unfit, the melancholic, the manic, the epileptic, the simply inconvenient, were deposited and forgotten. Families, overwhelmed by stigma or unable to cope, would commit their loved ones, sometimes with a heavy heart, sometimes with a chilling sense of relief. Once inside, the gates would close, and the world would shrink to the size of a cell, a crowded ward, a walled garden. Communication with the outside world was severed. Letters went unanswered. Visits became infrequent, then stopped altogether. The individual was lost to their own history, a ghost in a machine designed for forgetting. Then there was the punishment. The suffering was not merely a byproduct of neglect, it was often an active, prescribed part of the cure. The logic, twisted as it seems to us now, was rooted in the belief that madness was a moral failing, a weakness of character, or even a form of demonic possession. The patient, therefore, had to be broken. Their will had to be shattered so that sanity could be reimposed. This philosophy gave birth to a host of terrifying practices. Patients were subjected to torturous restraints, chained to walls for days, weeks, even years. They were plunged into ice-cold water in hydrotherapy sessions designed to shock the system into submission. They were strapped into spinning chairs and rotated at high speeds until they lost consciousness, the dizziness thought to somehow realign the disordered mind. These were not treatments, they were punishments disguised as medicine, administered in the name of a cure that was, itself, a form of torture. The pain was the point, the fear was the mechanism, and finally, and perhaps most tragically, people were erased. This was a deeper, more profound kind of violence, a systematic dismantling of personhood. Upon entering the asylum, a person's identity was the first casualty. Their name was often replaced by a case number. Their clothes were taken and replaced with a coarse, uniform-like garment. Their personal histories, their stories, their very essence as an individual with hopes, dreams, and memories were flattened into a few lines in a ledger, reduced to a clinical diagnosis of mania or hysteria. They were no longer a father, a daughter, a craftsman, an artist. They were simply an inmate. This erasure was social death. They were spoken about, but not spoken to. They were observed, studied, and catalogued, but rarely were they truly seen. In the most infamous institutions, like London's Bethlem Royal Hospital or Bedlam, this dehumanization reached its zenith, where patients became a public spectacle, with Londoners paying a penny to peer into their cells for entertainment. They were no longer people. They were curiosities, cautionary tales, figures of grim amusement. They were erased from their families, from public life, and ultimately from the shared story of humanity. This is the legacy we must confront, a history where the response to a cry for help was the clang of a locked door, where the promise of care was a lie, and where the deepest wounds were inflicted not by the illness, but by the cure. If you were anxious, depressed, or hearing voices, you weren't helped, you were locked away. For centuries, the human mind has been a source of wonder, a universe of thought and feeling contained within each of us. But when that universe is thrown into chaos, when the familiar landscape of the self becomes strange and frightening, how have we responded? Our history is not one of consistent compassion or understanding. Instead, it is a long, dark corridor of fear, judgment, and profound misunderstanding. Before the language of medicine gave us a framework for empathy, we had a different vocabulary, one forged in superstition and moral certainty. Mental illness wasn't seen as medical. It was not a condition of the brain, but a stain on the soul. It was seen as a moral failure, a sign of divine punishment, or, most terrifyingly, the work of demonic possession. In this world, there was no diagnosis, only judgment. There was no treatment, only condemnation. The lines were drawn with brutal simplicity. Sadness meant weakness, a character flaw to be overcome through sheer will or prayer. Melancholy was not a chemical imbalance, but a spiritual failing. Anxiety was a lack of faith, and hallucinations meant demons. The voices one heard were not symptoms of psychosis, they were the whispers of malevolent spirits. The visions one saw were not tricks of the mind, but glimpses into hell itself. This belief system left no room for sickness, only for sin. It turned the afflicted into the accused and their suffering into a spectacle of public shame. Yet even in the ancient world, flickers of a different way of thinking emerged. In the 4th century BCE, the Greek physician Hippocrates, often called the father of medicine, proposed a radical idea. He argued that mental disorders were not caused by supernatural forces but by natural ones. He developed the theory of the 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. An imbalance in these bodily fluids, he claimed, was the root of all ailments, including those of the mind. An excess of black bile, for instance, was thought to cause melancholia. While scientifically incorrect, this was a revolutionary step. For the first time, it placed mental suffering firmly within the realm of the body, suggesting it could be studied and treated, not just punished. It was a fragile seed of medical thought, but one that would struggle to grow in the centuries that followed. As Europe entered the Middle Ages, much of this early medical knowledge was lost or suppressed. The focus shifted back towards the supernatural. Yet, in another part of the world, a beacon of compassionate care was lit. During the Islamic Golden Age, from the 9th to the 12th centuries, a different approach flourished. Cities like Baghdad were home to pioneering hospitals known as Bimaristans. These were not prisons, but places of healing. They were the first institutions to have dedicated psychiatric wards, offering sanctuary and treatment to those with mental afflictions. Here, patients were treated with dignity. Physicians documented conditions like mania and depression and employed therapies that included calming music, baths, and talk. It was a holistic model of care that was centuries ahead of its time, a testament to the idea that healing requires humanity. But this enlightened approach was an exception. In late medieval Europe, a darker tide was rising. The fear of witchcraft was taking hold, and with it, a new lens through which to view mental distress. In 1487, this fear was codified in a book that would cast a long and bloody shadow over history, the Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches. This infamous text was a guidebook for witch hunters, detailing how to identify, prosecute, and punish those accused of consorting with the devil. It explicitly linked many behaviors we would now recognize as symptoms of mental illness, such as delusions, hallucinations, and social withdrawal, to demonic influence. It gave authorities a divine mandate to persecute the vulnerable. Women, in particular, were targeted. An elderly woman suffering from dementia, a young person experiencing a psychotic break, their symptoms were twisted into confessions of witchcraft under torture. The Malleus Maleficarum didn't just reflect a culture of fear, it actively manufactured it, justifying unimaginable cruelty and silencing any nascent understanding of mental health for generations. It cemented the tragic confusion between illness and evil, a confusion that would lead to the asylum, the straitjacket, and a legacy of suffering we are still working to overcome. The solution was confinement. Asylums were cold, overcrowded, and brutal. No therapy, no understanding, only isolation. At Bethlehem Royal Hospital, insanity became entertainment. People paid to watch patients like animals. Screams became spectacle. In the desperate search for a cure for mental illness, a dangerous idea took hold in the minds of physicians. The belief that a profound physical shock could jolt a disordered mind back into sanity. This theory, born from a fundamental misunderstanding of the brain, viewed madness not as a complex human experience, but as a machine that had malfunctioned. The goal was to force a reset, to violently interrupt the patterns of thought and behavior that defined the illness. This principle of shock therapy became the foundation for some of the most brutal and misguided treatments in medical history. It was an era where the line between healing and torture became terrifyingly blurred, all under the guise of scientific progress. The methods were varied, but the underlying philosophy was the same: to subdue the body in the hope of conquering the mind. Hydrotherapy was one of the earliest and most common forms of this approach. It began with the seemingly benign idea of using water to soothe or stimulate the nerves. However, in the harsh reality of the asylum, it mutated into a terrifying ordeal. Patients were subjected to baths of surprise, where they would be suddenly plunged into ice-cold water. They might be bound to a chair and have powerful jets of freezing water aimed at them for hours, a practice known as douche therapy. The shock to the system was extreme, intended to exhaust the patient into a state of calm submission. Conversely, some were placed in warm baths for days on end, their skin becoming waterlogged and pruned in an attempt to pacify their agitated nerves. These treatments were not about comfort. They were instruments of control, designed to break the patient's will. The pursuit of shock led to the invention of mechanical contraptions straight from a nightmare. One of the most infamous was the centrifugal spinning chair, developed in the early 19th century by Erasmus Darwin, grandfather of Charles Darwin. Patients were strapped into a chair suspended from the ceiling and spun at high speeds, sometimes over 100 revolutions per minute. The theory was that the intense centrifugal force would redistribute blood in the brain, supposedly clearing the congestions that caused insanity. The actual effect was violent nausea, vomiting, and vertigo. Patients would often lose consciousness, a state the physicians interpreted as a therapeutic success. This treatment was nothing more than a sophisticated instrument of disorientation, leaving the patient too sick and dizzy to exhibit any manic behavior. At the other end of the spectrum was the terrifying concept of total sensory deprivation. If overstimulation was the problem, some doctors reasoned, then its complete absence must be the cure. Patients were confined to quiet rooms or isolation chambers, often padded and completely dark. They were cut off from all light, sound, and human contact for days, sometimes weeks. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of their own breathing and heartbeat. This was not a peaceful retreat. It was a descent into a psychological abyss. The human brain, starved of sensory input, begins to create its own reality. Patients experienced vivid hallucinations and profound paranoia. The isolation didn't cure their illness. It often created a new, more terrifying form of psychosis, shattering their connection to the world entirely. The 20th century brought what seemed like more sophisticated scientific shocks. In the 1930s, a Viennese physician named Manfred Sakel introduced insulin coma therapy. He discovered that a large dose of insulin could induce a deep coma by drastically lowering a patient's blood sugar. The theory was that this physiological reboot could reset the brain's chemistry. For weeks, patients would be subjected to daily injections, slipping into comas that lasted for an hour or more before being revived with a glucose solution. The risks were immense. The procedure could easily lead to prolonged comas, irreversible brain damage, or death. Survivors often woke up confused and terrified, with significant memory loss. While some doctors reported success, particularly with schizophrenia, the treatment was unpredictable and incredibly dangerous, a high-stakes gamble with a patient's life. Perhaps the most notorious of all shock treatments is electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT. Developed in 1938 by Italian neurologists Ugo Ciletti and Lucio Bini, it involved passing an electrical current through the brain to induce a grand mal seizure. The initial theory was flawed, based on the incorrect observation that people with epilepsy rarely had schizophrenia. In its early unmodified form, ECT was brutal. Patients were fully conscious when the electricity was applied, and the resulting seizure was violent, often causing muscle tears, broken bones, and severe dental damage. The terror preceding the treatment and the profound confusion and memory loss that followed were deeply traumatic. While modern ECT is administered under anesthesia with muscle relaxants and is considered a last resort treatment for severe depression, its history is a stark reminder of the desperate and often cruel lengths to which medicine went to control the uncontrollable. For countless individuals subjected to these cures, the result was not healing. It was a deeper fragmentation of the self. Stripped of their autonomy, subjected to physical and psychological torment, many patients lost themselves completely. Their memories were erased, their personalities flattened, their spirits broken. They were left in a state of perpetual confusion and fear, their original condition often worsened by the very treatments meant to save them. The shock that was intended to reset the mind instead shattered it, leaving behind a hollow echo of the person who once was. Mental health care exists today because humanity finally admitted one truth: cruelty never heals.